Shabbat Shalom, everyone. How are you? Good to see everyone here today. All right, so as Joe said, the parsha this week is Noach, which means rest or comfort is probably the more literal translation. And my goal this morning is to remind you guys that we have to reprogram our brains a little bit, okay? I think we tend to view the stories of the Torah and Scripture in general as separate and distinct, and at the expense of missing the overall picture, the full narrative, if you will, even though I know it's not just literature, but, I'm doing my best with the language that I have. And I think that this is just sort of a leftover thing from our indoctrination, right? These are fantastic stories, fairy tales that we don't contemplate much. We love to teach our kids about them, but they're not really a big deal to us. And I think that it's akin and along the same vein as the thinking that gives us those pages in our Bibles that says Old Testament and New Testament that we should just rip out. It's along the same line. So to start, I'm actually going to jump back a little bit, which I think is sometimes a good thing to do because you can get away from the separation that I just talked about. You get out of the mindset of this was last week's Parsha, this is this week's Parsha. If you start back a couple verses, at least for me, it keeps the context and it gets you going. So I'm not going to tell you what verse I'm in because I'm going to give you guys a pop quiz. You guys weren't ready. All right, so let's see. The way that the beginning of this verse reads in the Hebrew is Vayikra et Shmo Noach. All right? So I thought it would just be a little bit of fun since we're going to be talking about the mitzvot in Vayikra, going forward. Who remembers what Vayikra means? Oh, you can just say it out. And he called, right. So the verse reads in English, and he called his name Noah, saying, this one does comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which Yahweh has cursed. All right, so, sorry, Miss Heather, I'm going to make you work a little bit. I just want to point out, sorry, whoa, that was really loud. I just want to point out a phrase here. There's just a single word in the Hebrew, and it's for the part where it says, he shall comfort us. And that is, Yenachamenu, okay? So what I want us to focus on, though, is the root Nacham. Okay, this is related to the name Noach. Obviously, context tells us that this word describes Noah, which means comfort, right? So the way that the Hebrew write is unlike our Western view. They say things like, the comforter comforts, whereas we try to find synonyms for everything because to us that's boring and redundant, but that's called Hebrew word pun. That's just how they write. Okay, so just keep this in mind. I'm going to come back to it in just a second. All right. So, finishing this, that was chapter 5, verse 28 and 29, in case you guys didn't already figure that out. And so finishing up chapter 5, we hear that Lamech dies and that Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so I'm going to pick back up in chapter 6. Let's see. Starting in verse 5. And Yahweh saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Now, verse 6 says, I don't want to butcher this, so let me get out my notes. Vayin Nacham Yahovah. Okay? So, this is really interesting to me. In the context of this verse, it says, and Yahweh was sorry. Okay? So we have this conundrum where this word has a double meaning. it means comfort, but it also means to regret. Okay? So, the reason that I'm bringing this up is because since I'm talking about the bigger picture here, and since the reading cycle just restarted, I thought it might be a good time to tackle an important issue. This is why we use the Hebrew names and put so much emphasis on the Hebrew text. Because do you see the wordplay here? Look, not only does it describe Noah, this word, but it describes why God is going to use Noah. Because he's sorry. He regretted that he made man. Okay? So, whenever we use the Hebrew names, it's because the name and the language around the name describes the person and their responsibility. So going back to last week's Parsha, we have Adam, who came from Adamah, the earth. His job was to keep, to shamar, guard and protect the garden, the earth, right? And to the earth he returned. He's tied to the earth. The earth is his responsibility. In Shemot, in Exodus, we have Moshe. And he was named Moshe. Why? Because she drew him out of the waters, right? So Moshe means to draw out. Well, guess what? It's also his responsibility to draw Israel up out of Egypt, right? And then, of course, most importantly maybe, we come to Yeshua later on. And Miriam is told that you will name him Yeshua, salvation. Why? Because he will save his people from his sins. So, this is why we use the Hebrew names and put so much emphasis on the Hebrew text, okay? And I would also venture to say maybe even that using the name Yeshua is another reminder for me, because whenever I use that name just in conversation, even if I don't consciously realize it, dots are forced to connect in my brain in this gray matter that I don't always use properly, and I have to understand who he is and what he did. I'm forced to understand that he is my salvation every time I use that name, period. You couldn't ask for better. So I just kind of chased that around. I'm sorry, I haven't even gotten to this parsha yet. So let's do that now. So Noah finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. And God tells Noah that he's going to flood the earth, and he instructs him to build the ark. Verse 18, he says he's going to make a covenant with Noah, which is going to be important later, covenant, whenever we meet that fellow Avram. All right? He tells Noah the manner in which the animals should be gathered. And here's an important point, chapter 7, verse 5. And Noach did according to all that Yahweh commanded him. Right? So that's just an important point I want to make, because I'm going to come back to that in a moment too. So verse 11 of chapter 7. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second new moon, so the second month, the 17th day of the new moon, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of the heavens were opened. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Sort of like how Israel was in the wilderness for 40 years and how Yeshua was tempted for 40 days and 40 nights. Does it sound like a whole story to anybody else already? Just wondering. So I wanted to just bring up a point, and it's interesting that, because Joe actually kind of already brought it up, God floods the world. We're talking about rain here. It was my pleasure to be able to spend nearly a week with Mr. Joseph DeMary and just be a sponge and let him talk to me and try to soak in as much as I can. And he shared with me something really cool. I'm going to go back, sorry. So, Joe talked about it. Do you guys remember this word? Yirah, to cast forth, which is where we get the word Torah from, right? And what is cast forth on the earth but rain, right? And Messiah says that it rains on the just and the unjust alike. Now, rain can be a blessing. We talked about it during Sukkot with the water libation ceremony, but in this context, it's very much not a good thing. God used it to, wipe everybody out. And, but what's the connotation? It's that the just and the unjust are held to the same standard. If you're feeling feisty, what would that standard maybe be? Right? By chance, the law that, teaches us what sin is. But, even in the context of this story, it rains on the unjust for sure. Every living creature dies, they drown. But it also rains on the just too. Noah had to brave the storm. Let me tell you what, 40 days and 40 nights of rain, and then nearly a year or something like that, if my math is right, for the waters to die down before he can come out. Look, if I had to spend 7 days in an RV with my family, I'd freak out, all right? Not to mention all the animals, so you're dealing with the stank and, all of that, right? I'm sure it wasn't comfortable. However, because of Noah's righteousness and because Noah heeded the word of the Lord, he got to be in a boat. Let that sink in, right? Even though it wasn't comfortable, he got to come out on the other side of that thing with his family just fine, right? So that begs the question, what is comfort? I just want to quote something that I read from a commentary and from a Rabbi David Foreman from Aleph Beta. And what's funny about this quote is it's not expounding scripture or anything. I just thought it was really well put. I did paraphrase a little bit, so if you try to look up the exact quote, it's not going to be the same. Comfort involves a kind of change in the perspective. We tend to ask ourselves, how could this have happened? And all we can do ultimately is say, but it happened. It happened anyway, and comfort is a stage of butness and neverthelessness. It happened, and I must deal with it. It's a change in perspective. It's a willingness to accommodate the uncomfortable reality. So what comes to mind is like, Job, right? All this stuff happens to Job, and he's like, God, could you just tell me why? And God's like, listen up, champ. Whenever you understand the nooks and crannies of creation, whenever you understand what it takes to make this show work, then that question deserves an answer. Or how about Moshe, right? Moshe, get a good look at the promised land over there because you're not going in. And let that be good enough for you. Oh, and by the way, go down and tell Israel everything that I told you to tell them. Right? And so, how could that be? How could that be fair? How could that be comfortable? How's that just? But see, we forget that God isn't bound by our perspective and definition of those things, right? Because most of the time, those definitions, the ones that we know, are the ones that the world gave us. And he's the boss. He makes the rules. So it's his definitions that we have to try to learn, right? So my question for you guys is, are we going to accept reality, live in it, and find comfort, or are we going to twist our circumstances, our resources, the people around us, to make it fit our reality? That's something I'm keeping in mind for sure. So after a while, the water subsides, and Noah and his family get off the ark. Noah makes offerings to God, and God promises to never flood the world through a covenant with Noah. Then Noah gets kind of loop-legged, lies down, and some weird stuff happens with his sons, which leads to the blessings of Shem and Japheth and the curse of Ham and his offspring. And then we get the genealogies of Noah and his sons. And we pick up in chapter 11 with a story that you all know well, the Tower of Babel. However, I'm just going to, make an argument, posit something, just to make you study, if nothing else. I'm just presenting information, and you take it for what it is and go from there. Now, I do want to preface this with, I'm a historian, okay? So the facet of the diamond that I find myself looking through the most whenever I have a question about Scripture is the historical context, okay? I'm just giving you that up front. Some people go other routes. This is just, it's how I'm wired now. You've probably heard before that they built this tower out of pride to go up and wage war with God or to challenge God or to be like God, in some way. But that might not be the case, right? Because if you were building a tower to go up to God, why would you do it in the plains of Shinar? One of the lowest points you could find. Whenever you could just go east just a little bit to present-day Iran, where there's hills and mountains, and you could get a head start, right? I'm just saying. I'm just setting it up, right? I'm just letting you guys kind of. It was not uncommon for ancient people to build towers called ziggurats, which fit the description of this passage, brick and mortar, and they were often described in other ancient texts as towers that stretched to the heavens. Now, let me tell you what, if you go and look up a picture of an ancient ziggurat, it doesn't hold a candle to our skyscrapers today. But at the time, man, like, those towers were like, they were the biggest buildings in the village, you know? Like, they stretched to the heavens. So ziggurats had the function of a temple. It's how ancient people serviced their little g gods, right? Because they thought that their gods needed food and sustenance and clothes and jewelry and things like that, right? The basic idea was that if you appease the gods will glorify you, right? And you'll win battles, and your name will be great. Oh, does that sound familiar to the passage? Right? And you'll have a lasting legacy, and you'll be the one that's set apart amongst all the people. And this is opposite from God's paradigm, guys, right? It's not us that we're trying to glorify. But here's where it gets interesting. Ziggurats were made for gods to come down and dwell amongst the people, right? So they tried to make one of these structures for not just a god, but the God of the universe. And you know what the ironic thing is? He did come down. It literally says, and Yah came down, right? And, getting used to this whole microphone thing. God does come, sorry. So he comes down, he scatters the people, he confuses their language, the very thing they said they didn't want, let's do this so our name will be great and so that we'll have a legacy. We won't be scattered and spread out, we'll be awesome. And he just goes, sorry, But how does this fit the bigger picture, right? Because that's what I'm trying to get you guys to look at. Well, at the end of this chapter, we're introduced to Avram, who becomes Abraham. And through him, God establishes a people and puts his name and his reputation on them. He teaches them how to create a proper dwelling place through the tabernacle and later the temple. He reverses the paradigm. He teaches Israel how he should be worshiped and how to glorify him. And guess what? God is so awesome that if you bless him, he's going to bless you. And of course, he sets Israel apart from all the nations, and they today have a lasting legacy because of him. So you don't have to take this interpretation to heart, but it just fits too well, at least in my mind. So does this make sense? Awesome. Can't wait to fellowship with you guys here in just a little bit. Thank you.